Hello, and welcome to another edition of Sri's Sunday New York Times Read-Along. Our guest today is Neil Amdur, former reporter and sports editor for the New York Times. He's also an author, director, and producer. Our host, of course, is Sri Srinivasan, the Marshall Loeb Professor at the Stony Brook School of Journalism and co-founder of Digimentors, a digital and virtual events consultancy. I may not sound like it, but I am Neil Parekh, the executive producer and guest host. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. It is a pleasure to be with you today. My voice is a little hoarse, but we are thrilled to be here, and it's always a pleasure to have another Neil on the show. And we've also had Neil Genslinger from the Times. So those three Neils, and we all spell our names the right way. So that's one thing to note. For people who are watching on replay, thank you for joining us. You're catching the very beginning of the show. Please share this with your friends. Please tag your friends, retweet. Make sure you click play on the video so that if you comment, we will see your comments. We have Jonathan Borstein joining us from the East Village. I want to note again, that's Jonathan Borstein. And my mom from New York this week. Hi, Mom. Glad you made it back from Seattle visiting my sister and nephew. It's a little easier to watch at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 5:30 a.m., which she'd been doing for the last 2 months or so. Vincent D'Souza saying hi and giving us a quick update on Olympics news. India's PV Sindhu won the bronze at Tokyo. Congratulations. Our friend Patricia Freudenberg is joining us, watching from New York and watching on LinkedIn. Again, we're live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We're also live on our Digimentors website. Doug Levy joining us early from Marin County, California, 5:30 a.m. Pacific time. Ron Thomas on the other side of the world, logging in from Dubai, just finished work and logging in as he always does. Thank you, Ron. Our friend Mo Kochmal, I haven't seen you comment recently. Hope you've been well. Joining in from New York and saying happy August. Today, of course, is August 1st. Hard to believe that we're already into August. Diane Stefani joining us from Margate, New Jersey. And Diane saying, cool jersey. Thank you, Diane. I always bust out the Yankee jersey and cap when we have New York Times sports writers and editors. It is always a thrill. Our guest again, just so folks know, is Neil Amdur, who's a former sports reporter and editor for the New York Times. We previously had George Vesey and Bill Roden and Claire Smith on the show as well. So I always like showing the colors when we do that. So with that, I'm going to bring on our host, Sri Srinivasan. Sri, good to see you.
Great to see you, Neil. And welcome, everybody. Happy Sunday and happy August. I can't believe it's August 1st already. Greetings, everybody. And thank you for joining us from around the world. Tell us where you're watching from and tell us how your Sunday's going and what your interest in the Olympics has been. Have you been watching a lot of it, very little, or somewhere in between? And we are seeing greetings coming in. Here is Rose Horowitz watching. Hi, Rose. Welcome. Rose is part of our team at Digimentors. And Carla Baranauckas is here. Carla brought us her former boss from the New York Times, Neil Amdur. Hi, Neil, and hi to Carla. And she's watching from New Jersey. Paula Kiger is watching from Tallahassee, Florida. Home of the Florida State University.
Just
making sure that, yeah.
Go Seminoles.
Because one of the things we'll talk to Neil about is that the other Neil Amdur, is that he wrote the first story about Gatorade And Gatorade, of course, comes from the Florida Gators and the University of Florida. So we'll have some fun with that in Gainesville. We have so much to cover today. Wayne Camadoy is watching. Looking forward to hearing from my first sports editor at the New York Times, and he's watching from Hohokus, and he's the Olympics bureau in Hohokus. We saw that the New York Times, which was going to force almost everybody back in at least a couple of days a week starting in September, is now indefinitely postponed that. And that means the Hohokus Bureau of New Jersey will continue. Patricia's watching and saying, "Go New York Yankees." That's for Neil. He's wearing his Yankee gear, as you see. And Chris Gorman, another big New York Yankee fan, is watching as well.
Absolutely.
We want to thank our incredible team that makes this all possible. So we want to say that this would not be possible without the Digimentors team that puts this together. Neil, of course, is our executive producer. Julia Weeks at Julia L. Weeks. Please follow them. Paula Kiger at Big Green Pen. Steve DeReeve at Steve DeReeve. And Carla Baranauckas at Kabara. We are so grateful to them. And if you like what you see here, we would love to work with you on a show of your own. If you have a conference, a summit, a webinar, a talk show, anything like this that you would like to work on, or any social and digital consulting, just email me or Neil at digimentors.group, or you can email me, Sri at digimentors.group. We'd love to talk to you about the kind of work that we do. If you're new to this show, we do this every Sunday at 8:30 a.m. Eastern, talking about the New York Times and print and journalism and facts. But we've also done other newspapers, including the Washington Post, as well as the Globe and Mail out of Toronto. And we've done the Star Ledger. And we are just really open to talking about journalism and media and the value of accurate, fair reporting. So that's why we're here. What we're going to do is bring Neil Amdur in just a minute. I'm going to give you a quick tour of the New York Times newspaper. We laid it out here. You'll see it in a second. And then we'll bring in Neil Amdur to talk to us about what's happening. Meanwhile, you see all these comments coming in from around the world. There's Brian watching from Sydney in Australia, former site of the Olympics in the year 2000. And Mike Richard, Neil took me away from the Bergen Record and hired me to join the New York Times sports desk in 1994. I hope you're well, Mr. Amdur. And we'll make sure to show some of these comments of people who know him so he can say hi to them directly. And by the way, if you know anyone interested in journalism, media, or what we're doing, tag them. They can watch live or later. And please share with your audience. Just reshare, retweet, whatever platform you're on. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So what I'm going to do now is just show you a little bit of what is happening in the newspaper, and then we'll bring Neil Amdur to join us. So let me show you the paper here. The front page we'll read with Neil together, but the lead story in the paper is, as Taliban stoke fear, multitudes flee Afghanistan. And this very dramatic cover image here is where vaccination rates are lowest, and showing us the problem in so many places. So we'll talk more about that. The New York Times Magazine cover is Matt Damon, his disappearing acts, the enduring career of the megastar no one really knows. So we'll ask Neil about his interest in movies and his work in documentaries as well. Requiem for a Dream, Amy Waldman, Better to Have Gone, Love, Death, and Quest for Utopia in Auroville by Akash Kapoor. This is about a settlement in southern India. So that'll be an interesting thing for us to talk about. Here's the Sunday Styles cover is You Anon, Pseudonymity and What It Means to Be Yourself in a Changing Online World with Competing Demands for Control. Hint, trolls aren't the only ones wearing masks. Okay. And here is a sports-related arts and leisure cover, Ted Lasso's World, Not David Brent's. So you may know this story on Apple TV. There's a show called Ted Lasso, and that's about, this is Jason Sudeikis' character, a very nice American football coach who becomes a manager of a hapless
English soccer team and his adventures. It's been a big hit, as you can see. And the cover is that it's about nice guy Ted Lasso rather than David Brent, the Ricky Gervais character on the British edition of The Office. And if you've seen both shows, you know that they're very different. And even the UK Office, the Michael Scott character is different from the David Brent's character in many ways. Okay, let's keep going here. Sunday review cover is Parenting Means Making a Million Decisions. Here's how to choose better. Ooh, that sounds really good and very useful. Metropolitan cover, A Clash Scrambles a Lifetime of Service. At the Capitol riot on January 6th, a retired police officer found himself on the other side of the law. Sunday business is 2,000 miles was not far enough. In the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, someone set a fire at a Goodwill in St. Paul. That led to an arrest in Mexico and exposed a growing system of global surveillance. And that's the business cover. And real estate in New York is a New York City home for less than $350,000. That sounds very surprising that that's possible, but apparently you can. You'll probably get a studio of some kind, but we'll see. And then, of course, the sports section, we're going to read that with our friend Neil Amdur in just a moment. Still the world's fastest woman from Jamaica, Elaine Thompson-Herah, won her second straight Olympic gold in the 100-meter dash, and Jamaica swept the medals. I, of course, am missing greatly the wonderful Usain Bolt and his legacy at the Olympics. I got to go to Jamaica one year, and as part of the tourism, they show you the home and the school that he went to in Jamaica near Montego Bay. All right, with that, let's remind you of who our guest is and what we're doing here today. Our guest is Neil Amdur. He is a former former reporter and sports editor for the New York Times. He's an author, director, and producer. He's worked at the intersection of civil rights coverage and journalism and sports. And we are so lucky to have him here today, just in time for the Olympics coverage.
Good morning, Sri. It's really nice to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time this morning. What are your Sundays like usually?
Well, it depends on weather, and it also depends on events. But sometimes I try to get out for some activity on Sunday morning, maybe a run, maybe some tennis, and then usually it's trying later in the day to check on family affairs and see whether we can do some things together as a family. So it varies. And lately, with the weather turning warmer, it's been nice and just staying active, as they say.
Very important. I went for a 2-mile walk this morning with my dog and got ready for you. That's the closest I'll get to any sports or exercise, alas. But I'm so grateful that you're with us today. And also your friends and fans from around the world are with us as well. So we're just happy that they could all be here. Stephen Kaplan's watching from Ramsey, New Jersey. He was a New York Times photo editor for 20 years. I'm sure you're overlapped at some point. Vincent D'Souza says, insane images at Tokyo Olympics. 2 guys agree to share the gold in high jump. Insane. Have you caught this news yet?
The high jump, I did not. I've been trying to follow this between watching it, at night and then trying to catch up in the morning. This is part of what the Olympics is doing now. It's a 24-hour event because of the time differences. And you usually have to really mire in and just try to follow everything as it's going on different levels. And it's also on different networks as well, which makes it all the more where you want to watch, prime time, or do you want to go on to some of the other circuits that they have it on? It's an adventure.
And is it what you understand from just this headline that they're sharing a gold? I guess in the Olympics, they set the bar and then you keep jumping. And then has that happened before where people say, okay, we're tied and we'll share the gold?
Well, I didn't see what the circumstances were here. A lot of times it can be decided on fewer misses or They have other technicalities, but if the two of them were both, let's say, at the each had the same circumstances along the way, rather than going into trying to raise the bar, and maybe the two of them decided to just share it, which is kind of nice. It's another good news story out of Tokyo, which we desperately need over there. And it's encouraging that athletes still have a sense of wanting to be a part of a larger circumstance than just their own well-being. So I look forward to following
Thank you. Martin Englisher says, good morning from Riverdale. Feeling bad for the athletes who have worked so hard and have no live audience. Glad you're bringing attention to the Olympics. And here's what Sharanya says, that high jump men's final was unbelievable, sharing the gold after they both have returned to these games from nearly career-ending injuries, and plus a world record set in the women's triple jump. So
I think that that's interesting that they continue to add events like this to encourage and broaden the perspective. There was never, for many years, there was no women's triple jump. And as there have extended the women's events into the marathon and other areas, when I first started covering track and field for the New York Times, the longest event for women was 800 meters. And it wasn't until they started adding the 1500, and then they went up and Joan Benoit Samuelson won the marathon, that they had an opportunity to really give the women a chance to show themselves on the broadest stage. Hey, Bill Roden, look,
really important.
Bill Roden stepping into the picture here. My goodness, it's good to see his signature there. And Bedell said,
I just want to say about Bill Roden, I'm a big fan. He was on our show before, and people can go back to our archives on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Srinet, and find my conversation with Bill. It was so wonderful, and he's such a great journalist. Thank you, Bill, for watching in the morning. And anything else you'd like to jump in and say, Neil, as we bring people on, please jump in. Here's Bedell Saget saying, Neil Amdur, my first sports editor, taught me so much.
Well, I know that a lot of the people who are signing in, and I've seen them earlier, were people that some of whom I actually hired, like Mike Richard, who is watching, and Carla Baranauckas, who's on your staff, was part of the women's movement that came to the copy desk when I was sports editor. Most of the time, when I first started at the Times, the copy desk was all male. And it was run like a little bit too chauvinistic for my taste, and we had to make some changes. So we brought in some very strong-minded women who were able to handle the pressures of deadlines and were able to handle the pressure of dealing with males who didn't often see women on the copy desk. And I think they were strong people, Mindy Matthews and Leanne Wilcox and others like Carla, Adrena Morris, strong-minded, really brought something to the table for the sports department.
That's terrific to hear. Before we move on, Neil, I want to tell you how much of an impact the New York Times has had on my life and show you concrete evidence of this and bring it to your story. One day when I was a student at Columbia Journalism School, before I would spend 20 years as a professor, we had a ethics course in which we had a special guest speaker brought by you to the class, and we were not told in advance who our special guest was going to be apart from you. And you walk in with Arthur Ashe. It was such an incredible day. I'll never forget that day. He came in, he talked about his diagnosis, his health situation. He talked about the media. And we were so honored to be in the presence of greatness. And I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about your connections to Arthur.
Arthur remains very special to me on many, many levels. Not simply journalistically covering his achievements as a tennis player, but and working with him on a book that we did after he left the game about his off-the-court experiences. But his dimension was so broad, and his continued search for new ideas and for growing as a person. I'll never forget going up to in 1968 in January when he was serving in West Point. He went in the military, and I wrote a story about his first opportunity there to express himself about some of the social issues that he wanted to get involved with. And Arthur was always looking to improve himself on so many levels. Of all the athletes I covered in generations, Arthur remains one of those very special people. And I think that it's too bad that we don't have him with us today, because I think Arthur was a global person who went to South Africa, who went around different places to Vietnam and places, and created his own and left his legacy in so many different ways. And I miss him. And I think we could use him even more today.
I completely agree. And to show you my interest in Arthur Ashe and the New York Times, I have in my hand a physical copy of the 1993 obituary of Arthur Ashe that I have saved all of these years. And I'm sure you and your team put this together. And that for the fact that I saved it and I could find it and have it here for you tells you how much your work has meant to us.
I'm still in communication with Jeannie Ashe, Arthur's wife, who has carried his legacy forward in so many different ways with charitable institutions and activities that Arthur would have been proud of. And Jeannie has understood Arthur's place, special place in the American landscape and the sports landscape. And I think that we don't often really take advantage of the contributions that athletes have made on many different levels. I think their performances that they do while they're competing are on one level, but so many of them, like Billie Jean King and others, have made contributions in other ways that are so important. And I think that's an area that needs to be explored in much more depth.
And you mentioned Jeannie, and here she is at that news conference in April 1992. And I also wanted to read the opening paragraph by Robin Finn, and I'd love you to talk about the obituary. Arthur Ashe, a tennis champion who spent his years in the sports fighting discrimination and then spent the final year of his life seeking to broaden public awareness on the subject of AIDS, died Saturday. He was 49.
Oh boy, 49 years old. And that's one of the things that I think we really don't care enough about, is some of these athletes who leave us at such an early time, Arthur being one of them. I'm also reminded of Steve Prefontaine, who was one of the most competitive athletes I ever covered in track and field as a middle distance and runner. And I can still see him at the 72 Olympics, on the last lap leading and then winding up finishing fourth. But if you go to Eugene, Oregon, Steve Prefontaine, and mention his name, you'll get an absolute chorus of people who respected him for not what he'd left just on the track, but the image and the personality that he was. And he died in an auto accident way too young. And as someone who was in my own auto accident early on, I can understand how people miss Pre even to this day. And it's very sad that those athletes leave us before they could have had a greater opportunity. And Arthur was one of them.
I could just wonder what he would make of some of the racial issues of today, including Colin Kaepernick's treatment by the NFL.
Arthur had a way of being able to look at the big picture, taking events and making sure that he didn't get too involved, in microcosm of what he believed in, because I think his view was always a little wider, a little broader, in the sense that he tried to understand and look ahead, not simply just live in the moment. And that's why I think he made so many contributions, not only on the court, but working in tennis administration, working in social administration, working with other people in different countries to connect the dots all the time. And that's why you have to respect the role that he played in making tennis not only an international sport, but a sport that looked at some of the social issues that to this day in South Africa are still resonating. And Arthur was there with Nelson Mandela at the time, and his trips often to Vietnam and other places made major headlines because it was what Arthur did and how he did it that was so important.
Thank you, Neil. Folks, if you're just joining us, we're talking to the great Neil Amdur, who is the former sports editor and former reporter at the New York Times. He's a director, author, producer. He'll talk about all of that in a few minutes. Let's look at some of the comments that have come in. Naomi Service says, Neil knows the right stuff. A pleasure, as always, to share my Upper West Side morning with the A-team and the New York Times read-along. Thank you. Therese Steiner is watching from Yonkers. Welcome, Therese. And Ron Thomas says, amazed to see all the people who have worked for you signing in and saying thanks. That's the sign of a great leader.
What's interesting, and here's Bill Roden, who is saying that named me Sports of the Times columnist in 1990. Always appreciate you. You deserved it, Bill. And it wasn't simply that Bill was somebody who had a voice, wanted to be heard, and has maintained that for such a long period of time. And I think that's the interesting thing, that some of the people that I hired who were, I'll never forget when I hired Tyler Kepner, who was a baseball writer and who's still at the Times. When I brought him in for an interview, Joe Lilliveld, who was the executive editor, looked at Tyler and he wasn't sure whether Tyler had been bar mitzvah yet because he was so young. But Tyler has been there forever and doing such a great job. And Buster Olney, who was another baseball writer who was hired, who went on to ESPN and has left a legacy in baseball there. So that's the proud thing of being able to find people that you respected, as Bill Roden was one of those, and Claire Smith and others, that you feel good about them, you follow their careers, and you're proud of the fact that they knew how to and what they wanted to achieve.
Awesome. Bedell says, we worked so hard under Neil. You left the office drained, but couldn't wait to come back and do it again. Another great sign of a leader. Bedell's watching on LinkedIn. So whatever channel you're on, folks, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, please share, tag a friend. They can watch live or later. Rehan says, thank you for remembering Arthur Ashe. I live in Richmond and he's still present here. Wayne says, Neil helped me set the tone on the importance of Olympics coverage. He wanted to go big. Now I have to jump on a call from Tokyo to plan for the day. I always appreciated when Neil would put a kind note in my mailbox and others for a job well done.
Well, the Olympics was a nonstop type of an event, and having covered Olympics in 1968 in Mexico City, sadly, I was there in Munich in 1972 with all of those events. And 76 in Montreal, 80. I was one of the few American journalists who was in Moscow when the U.S. boycotted in Moscow. And you really respect what these athletes put forward and the Olympics itself. And this has been a very complex Olympics because of the virus and because of all the other circumstances that are out there. So you respect both the athletes who are trying to achieve and the people who go there to cover. I saw John Branch had a piece in this morning's New York Times about the difference of this Olympics in Tokyo. A wonderful writer John is, and he brought all that measure to bear in trying to explain how Tokyo is different than others. And each Olympic seems to carve its own identity for better or worse, as Munich did. Oh, yeah.
And we had John Branch on our show just a few weeks ago as he was getting ready to go to Tokyo. So again, that's in our archives that you can find at youtube.com/3net. We're showing some of your interesting memorabilia, including a press credential from the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Was it a mistake for America to make that boycott, which resulted in the Soviet bloc boycotting the LA Olympics 4 years later?
I think that President Carter at the time was trying to make a statement about what he felt that the Russians had done in Afghanistan. But I think it's interesting that the athletes had to pay the price. I just did a story recently on one of the athletes who was Craig Beardsley, who set the world record in the butterfly right before the Olympics. He was from Harrington Park in New Jersey. And Craig was looking forward to a gold medal probably in Moscow. The winning time in Moscow was slower than his world record at the Olympic trials. And here it is, we're coming, years later. And Craig, I think, appreciated the support he had gotten at home. But I think the hurt was very long for him that the U.S. had pulled out. The Russians boycotted in '84 and for the Los Angeles Olympics, which served no purpose. And I think that President Carter's move at the time, while it may have been very dramatic and bold and trying to let the Russians know, I'm not sure whether that was in the best interest of the athletes and how much time was spent really looking at the whole picture. Because these days, as you can see from the disorganization that exists at the international level among these various governing bodies, from gymnastics to weightlifting, and all over the place with the problems they have, and even at the International Olympic Committee, they don't have the best people in the best jobs there. And as a result, things get torn apart and the athletes pay the price.
Thank you. You are so right about that. There is talk of a possible movement towards a boycott of the Winter Olympics because of what's happening in China. What would your message be to American politicians and others interested in this topic?
I would say be careful what you wish for. The Chinese are putting in a lot of effort, as the Times noted this morning in its story about Chinese Olympic, as they're modeling after what the Russians used to do in nationalized programs. So if you're going to play hardball with the Chinese for the Olympics, be prepared for circumstances that will be coming along. And I think that's what many of the people who are affiliated with international organizations don't understand. They live in the moment. They're very conscious of what they think are the right things to do. But many of them are really not affiliated with athletes in themselves. They're businessmen, or they take these jobs because they think it's going to get them a free trip somewhere, or they think it's going to give them an identity. And what's lost in the whole picture is the scope of what they're doing. And that's why I fear that as we live in this boycott-laden opportunity time, mistakes are made, and they're often the payback is much more severe, not only for the athletes, but for all across the board. And I think we need to find better people to be running these organizations that understand all levels of participation.
Thank you. Diana says, I was in Eugene, Oregon last month. That's so true about Steve Prefontaine. And as you mentioned, him leaving us too early. And Bedell is in Tokyo right now. So this is so cool. By the way, there is news about the men's 100 final. And my instinct would be not to talk about the winning time or the person, but I know that we now live in a different world where people get the news all the time. So Neil, shall we tell you who won?
Yeah, please do.
The winner was from Italy. The Italian Lamont, I have to look up his name, is the person who just flashed across my screen.
Really?
And he gets the unofficial title of the world's fastest man.
Well, I don't know whether you happen to have seen my story on my Facebook page that I did. It was maybe a month or two ago about the world's fastest human title. And it provoked.
Yeah, please tell us more.
Well, I wrote this story because there's been a lot of talk about who was going to be the world's fastest human here in Tokyo. And, now that Usain Bolt who was the world's fastest human. And I wrote a column, I guess you could call it. It was on Facebook, and I don't usually write pieces that often on Facebook, but I felt like I had to send a message out there. And what I wrote was, in my mind, there was only one world's fastest human, and that was Bob Hayes. And I said that with respect for Bob Hayes, who was an Olympic champion, who was an all-pro football player. Oh, there you go. Those are Bob Hayes's legs. And you've got the story up there. And it provoked some interesting comments from people, some of whom competed against Bob. And I felt that we never saw all that Bob was capable of doing, because he was winning so easily, like he did in that 4x100 relay when he came from far back with maybe the fastest split ever recorded. He was a very special human being on many levels. And another one that we lost too early with his circumstances in passing. But I know Bolt was taller and probably ran faster splits on hard surfaces. But in my mind, Bob Hayes, and he changed the game of football as we know it, pro football, because when he came into the game with his speed, defenses had to adjust dramatically, as Gil Brandt of the Dallas Cowboys reminded me when I mentioned it to him. And I think that's why when you start throwing titles around to people that, because it's in the moment, I would be careful about that, because I think there are people who deserve a certain measure of respect and immortality. And Bob Hayes, like Arthur Ashe, like Billie Jean King, like these people, they deserve to have that place in the sun forever.
Got it. Thank you. And let's take a look at this. This is Italy's Lamont Marcel Jacobs, and he wins the men's 100-meter gold. Of course, very unusual for Italy to win in this particular category, but we know they're having a great year since they won the Euro Cup as well in soccer.
That's what's happening, and you got to believe maybe there's some message going on over there that they're doing it right.
Here's Mo Krochmal's watching. He says, I help launch NewYorkTimes.com. These days, I teach and advise a student newspaper at Fairleigh Dickinson in Teaneck. I'm interested in the skills today's sports journalists should have. Can you talk about skills and training?
I think that when I started in journalism, it's interesting because I wanted to be a journalist, but I was interested in broadcast before I was interested in writing. And I had my own radio show when I was in high school that my father bought radio time, a high school football show. And I was writing my scripts and I went in, but I never thought that voice-wise that I could be John Sterling doing a doubleheader and last. So I switched to writing. Nowadays, I think the person who goes into journalism has to be much more versatile in terms of what they want and what their roles are. So I would encourage people who have an interest in journalism to look at not only the writing aspect of it, but also look at film, look at documentaries, look at the possibility of creative writing, look at breaking news, because these are things that with platforms today, so many different platforms looking for creative people, looking for good editors who know what the story is. And I think that's been one of the problems that we have with some journalists today. They live in the moment so much that when a story breaks, you get a story coming out by someone written in the moment without the perspective that necessarily will bring the reader, the viewer, whoever that person is, into the mix. And I think those skills have to be taught in many different ways. A person who can write, but also should be holding a camera to be able to, maybe if they have to go out and film something, in addition to doing their writing on the scene, they're versatile enough to be able to do that. And unfortunately, I think what's happened in some of the material courses today in the college and the high school level, they're losing creative writing courses. They're losing reporting courses because they think, oh, well, today it's all in the moment. And they're changing to fit into what they think is what is being taught is more appealing for Facebook, maybe for YouTube, as opposed to teaching someone what the story is, how you get to the story, how you appreciate the story, and what you can do with it. I remember covering a high school football game for the Miami Herald in 1964, I guess it was. There was Coral Gables played Miami High School at the time. They had a quarterback on the Coral Gables team named Larry Rentz, who was a young kid who was very skinny, and he also had a speech impediment but still allowed him to compete. He never lost a game in the years that he played, the 2 years that he played for Coral Gables. And in this big game, when I went out to cover the game, I came back to the office after Coral Gables won, and I said, what can I do with this story? one of the few times in my career I tried this, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for everybody, but I wrote poetry inside my game story of the Coral Gables Miami High game that year. And I wrote four-line stanzas, each ending with the line, "There's no defense for Larry Rentz. He shirks the shadows of defeat. Each ride with fate, he boldly cheats. He guides his team with cold finesse. There's no defense for Larry Rentz." And I put that 4 stanzas. Fortunately, I had an editor that night, Tim Finkel, who was running the desk, and who, when he heard that I was doing this, he agreed to run those poetry inside my game story. Now I've never done anything like that in all the years that I've since then. But for that night, in that moment, I thought it was, and Larry Rentz became a legend in the state of Florida, went on to the University of Florida, played a career at quarterback there with Steve Spurrier, also went on for a season with the San Diego Chargers. So I think, trying poetry, I'm not suggesting or endorsing it, but in the moment when you're prepared to try something, don't be afraid and feel like, wait a minute, it hasn't been done, therefore I'm not going to try this. I did it. My editor at the time supported me, and the poetry became kind of one of those things that has lasted, and I'm so proud of it to this day, because I felt like it was a one of a kind. And that's where, when you're talking about skills and training, if you're willing to step out and know you're doing it from a position of strength, then that's part of what will get you succeed.
Thank you very much. I think that's a great little clip that we're going to share with folks, and a nice mini lesson there about what skills folks need. I want to read a comment that came on Twitter about this conversation. We have our friend Patricia Freudenberg says, "Love hearing these behind the scenes stories." And also, right off the start, great conversation and heartwarming stories. Like, I'll say it before and I'll say it again, New York Times read along, more than just the news. And that's certainly very important for us. And Mo says, "Thank you for the answer and great stories. Inspirational. I'll share it with my students." Let's take a look at some of the other landmark stories you've done. We have some nice images that we want to share with you. So we'll put them up on screen, and then you can walk us through them.
Happy to.
So here we go. Let's take a look at some of the images from the collection of Neil Amdur. We have so many different incredible stories that you've had to cover over the years. And stay tuned when I ask him about him being in a hijacking as well. But let's start with this. What are we looking at here? When thin is in, disaster can strike.
When thin is in, disaster can strike. I think that's a story, I believe. Is
Concern after a gymnast death. Yeah.
Oh, yes. I think these stories become the kind of stories that you have to deal with and try to find a way to be able to report them. And I was confronted with some of these stories at different stages of my career. One of them was at the time in 1983, I believe. It was when a middle distance runner named Mary Wazetter, who was struggling with bulimia and anorexia. She went back to her hometown in Pennsylvania and jumped off a bridge and was paralyzed. She survived. She wrote a book about it. She's still around. And yet I wrote this story because I felt it was important for athletes who were trying to be and encouraged to be lean and mean and tough. And I think gymnasts are in the same position. And so are the athletes in other sports, particularly in individual sports, track and field, swimming, gymnastics. And interestingly enough, you're talking about the gymnast and stories too. I mean, what we're reading about from Tokyo and seeing on the visuals about the gymnastics and people withdrawing, Simone Biles, and what she's gone through. And I took the liberty of calling one of my dear friends, Jim Lair, who's a sports psychologist, who has been very instrumental in writing about mental toughness. And one of the things that Jim said in our conversation, and he is just such a legendary figure, is that these athletes are taught very young how to win. And that's what's important in terms of their winning. But then when they comes to their growth as a person, there's something missing in that growth. And Jim was pointing out that, and I wrote some of the notes down that he said, and when he was talking about climbing the mountain, he says something about, in view of the mountain, when you climb it, he says, what is the journey like, to the top of the mountain? And I believe that's so important today when we see these athletes that are struggling. Michael Phelps has admitted it. We had Naomi Osaka, who has, again, came up as a tennis player, blessed with a lot of talent, winning. But what was going on behind the scenes in her growth as a person? And I think the gymnast that you pointed up there is, again, another factor. Are they growing as a person? Is the coach or is the advisor or are the parents teaching them about growing as a person as opposed to just winning medals and trophies?
Thank you. Let's look at another one. Well, so here is about Castro upset over U.S. athletes.
I guess if this is this from my trip to Havana in 1971?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. This is how, when you talk about stories and being prepared for what you're going to do, as one of the gentlemen wrote earlier about what to talk to students about. I was covering the Pan American Games in 1971 in Cali, Colombia. This was for the New York Times. There were a lot of good stories there, but one of the stories that was emerging was that the U.S. volleyball team, in order to qualify for the Munich Olympics, had to go to Cuba in order to play in a tournament there to qualify. So the question then became, do I as a reporter follow the athletes volleyball team to Cuba, or do we simply let them go and see what happens? Well, I called my office and they said, if you could get on a plane with the volleyball team, go ahead. Now, this is 1971. Castro was in office for a number of years, but he was still young and his team was just beginning to perform on the international stage. I went with the volleyball team to Cuba. I spent 10 days in Cuba and wrote a story every day out of Cuba. And part of what I was writing about there were a variety of stories, everything from Kid Chocolate, the legendary boxer, to Fidel Castro holding press conferences and dealing with the presence of the U.S. volleyball team there. And of course, the volleyball team did not win in Cuba, but the stories that came out of there were very important because I was in Cuba. There were only a handful of journalists. Neil Leifer, a photographer from Sports Illustrated, was there. But we got an opportunity to go around and follow what was going on the sports scene. And that background was forever life-changing for me.
Thank you. Let's go on to another image that we've collected here.
Oh, there's the Arthur Ashe. That's the story that I did on him when he was at West Point.
And this is 1968, and
yes.
It says, Arthur Ashe, net pro of future, prepare civil rights talk.
And this was the first time that Arthur agreed to go on the record and talk about social issues, which he was going to elaborate on further at a speech that he was giving in Washington, D.C. later. And I think Arthur knew at the time that this was going to create some buzz because he had not spoken out much. And there were some people who felt that Arthur, they wanted him to be more active at the time, particularly with the Olympic Project for Human Rights forming in 1968 with the Mexico City Olympics. And so there was some criticism of Arthur's voice or not really speaking out. But this was where he agreed to talk about his feelings and what they were. And it really set the tone for Arthur's future activity and involvement, and his willingness to be photographed in his military uniform, speaking out while he was in the military, was really something special. And for me to have that opportunity to do it remained very special for me all through the years. And when Arthur and I did this book, Off the Court, which was his look of things that he did off the court, and that book wasn't written until much later after he retired, Arthur was much more honest about some of the things that happened to him along the way as well.
Thank you. Let's keep looking, and then we'll get to the paper. This is a story that you wrote. So tell us about this. 4 feared, pervaded hours described by passenger.
I'm sure everybody who takes a trip looks at themselves and wants to have as uneventful a trip as you can have. I was going to cover that weekend the Quantico Relays in Virginia. This is in May of 1972. And my wife and I had taken our 2 boys to Pennsylvania. My mother was going to watch, and then my wife and I were going to go to Washington and spend the weekend in Washington after the Quantico Relays. So the flight that we were taking was out of Allentown, Pennsylvania. It was a short 40-minute flight, routine, and then we go from there. When we boarded the flight, keep in mind, this is 1972, and there were at the time a significant number of hijackings going on, but this was the last thing in my mind when we boarded that flight for a 40-minute flight. We just figured Allentown and to Washington, nothing to worry about. P.S. We're on the flight about 20 minutes in, and the captain comes on and says there's an armed man aboard. Now, I had never had anything on all the travels that I had done, never come across anything of that kind. And it was one of those life-changing experiences for you because you're sitting there, you don't know what's going on when he says an armed man aboard, and you turn around and you look in the back and you see someone who's dressed in a suit and maybe holding something. Is he holding a gun? Is he holding a grenade? Is he holding explosives? We were on the plane for 4 hours. We were there, and this was a gentleman who had boarded the flight in Allentown. He lived in Easton, Pennsylvania. He was an engineer. At the time, he wanted for Eastern Airlines cash to get, as the plane landed in Dulles, we were supposed to land at Reagan. He went to Dulles. Eastern gave him $303,000 in exchange for which he would allow us to leave the flight. Meanwhile, while we were on board, people were petrified. A woman sitting across from us in the aisle was holding her rosaries. And I will tell you, as I wrote in my lead of the story, which if they want to put it back up, you could see it. I think I said in that I'll never tell another joke about airline hijacking, not after the harrowing 4 hours I spent aboard Eastern Airlines Flight 178 today. As it turned out, the hijacker let us off the flight after 4 hours. I called my office and asked them if they wanted me to file some kind of a story, which I did as the first reporter who had ever been on a hijacked plane. That person took the flight and the crew and took it down to New Orleans, where he changed planes because there had been some mechanical problems. And then he had the crew take him, and he flew over Honduras, where he had 2 parachutes and bailed out over Honduras with the $303,000 that Eastern Airlines had paid out. He stayed in Honduras for a month, where the authorities had launched a full-scale investigation, and bounty hunters were after him with a $25,000 reward. A month later, he turned himself in with relatives from Honduras. He was originally from there. He was tried and convicted for life in prison, spent 11 years in prison when he was released from prison, and he died about 6 years after that. One of the most frightening experiences, but it also was something that taught me that you just never know how life is going to deal those for you, because this was May of 72. And in September of 72, I went to the Munich Olympics, and you know what happened there with the Israeli Olympians. And I was there when that happened. And you say to yourself, you just don't know how these circumstances will come up and affect your coverage. And to this day, Munich remains one of the most poignant moments in my journalism career.
And of course, they finally paid official tribute at the opening games to the slain Israeli athletes. And also the movie, I think between those two things, more people are now aware of what happened in Munich. But the idea was that the games must go on, so they just didn't talk as much as they could have and should have. over those years. Let's look at Mark's comment. He's watching from North Carolina. What a harrowing experience, he says. And also very unusual lead, as you said, for a New York Times story where you talk about not making a joke. And I don't think I've ever seen that in the paper before or since. Let's take a look at another part of your journalism career. And this is the famous men versus women story, Billie Jean King against Bobby Riggs. And you and a female reporter were asked to write a column, each matching columns, competing columns, that ran in 1973 before the event. And Grace Lichtenstein predicted King will win in 4 sets. And you said Riggs will win in 3 sets. So let's hear it.
I couldn't, naturally, I'm going to give Grace her due, because there's no way that Grace was going to pick Bobby Riggs to win that. And I was only too happy to take Riggs because I had covered the Bobby Riggs-Margaret court match earlier that year when Bobby destroyed a nervous Margaret out in California. And that's when finally Billie Jean decided to get into the mix. So it became a battle of the sexes and network television, and just humongous event at the Houston Astrodome, no less. I think they had something like 37,000 people there. And I went down to cover the event, and it was classic. I mean, Riggs was one of those characters that was from another time and place. And Billie Jean was, to her credit, she handled it beautifully. And I think that showed at the time, at a very critical time for women's tennis, 1973, only a year or two after the women really had launched their independent tour to Breakaway. And I think the statement she made in beating Bobby and doing it in a way that showed that she could serve and volley and put the pressure on and make a statement, I think that was something that benefited women's tennis in the long run. And I think that women were forever grateful, not only those who watched on television and were able to turn around to their husbands and say, see that? Billie Jean did it. But to this day, I think Billie Jean, who has remained in the forefront of activities related to social and sports issues, as have other women like Chris Evert, who were part of that time period. You have to give credit to Billie at the time, because Bobby was a cagey character. He knew what he wanted to do, but Billie Jean wouldn't let him do it.
Let's take a look at another part of your story and your journey.
Whoops.
You mentioned Chris Evert.
Yes. Well, that was a younger Neil on the left. And and I'll tell you something about Chris. I see her on television now, and she continues to, she has that look about her that is just amazing. And I will tell you something. I wrote a story about Chris Evert when she was 7 years old in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And her father was the tennis pro at the courts there. And to this is a long time ago, but Chris has maintained the consistency, the continuity of someone that you just have to respect on many different levels. And there were people who always expected more from Chris in different ways, but I always knew that Chris knew who she was. She had great parental support from her mother and her father, her mother traveling with her all the time. And they never made Chris to be something that she didn't want to be. And they also, I think, brought her along and helped her adapt, because in 1971, when she came and made a storm at the US Open in 1971, she was a young player at the time, a teenager, and she got to the semifinals, and I think may have lost to Billie Jean there. But I think Chris was always true to herself. And that is one of my 10 commandments, maybe the first: be true to yourself. And I think she has been to this day.
I like that. That's very, very cool. We'll do a couple more things from your past, and then we're going to go into reading the paper. It's already 9:29, so we have about 4 more hours of reading ahead of us, Neil. Let's take a look.
Oh, boy. Tommy Smith, John Carlos, 1968, Mexico City. Do you realize how far we've come? Think about this. In this day and age, the Olympic Project for Human Rights was 1968 when Lee Evans, Tommy Smith, John Carlos, Harry Edwards, who was the professor at San Jose, when they were preaching about equality, preaching about the need for more issues to get on the forefront. And Smith and Carlos paid a steep price for that demonstration at the Victory Stand, which, when you look at it today, by today's standards, was very mild-mannered. Symbolically, there was nothing more forceful that you could have asked for. But the IOC was so unaware and so unprepared for that they banned them at the time. And now you look at Black Lives Matter and you say to yourself, wait a minute, this is 2020, Black Lives Matter. Didn't we just have that in 1968? And it showed you the continuity of things. And that's why I have the respect for John and Tommy that's been maintained over the years, because they went there, they accomplished what they set out to do. They made a statement. That statement was forever lasting. It's bonded in time. It's now become even more prominent in the social order. And you have to say that both of them have finally gained the respect that they deserved. And having been there to see it, to taste it, to feel it, you can appreciate now, as many of African Americans are trying to deal with circumstances today, Smith and Carlos were way ahead of their time.
Thank you. Real heroes. And while we've seen a lot of progress, I think there's still a long way to go, and especially the way, as we said before, how Colin Kaepernick's been treated. Ron says, this show just boggles my mind. Every Sunday is a learning experience, a true learning experience. Thanks, A-Team, and thank you, Ron, watching and supporting us all the way from Dubai. Sudha Parekh, the other Neil's mom, says, great history of sports we would not have known otherwise from any source, Neil. Your talk is very useful. Arthur Ashe used to come and play and teach tennis at Riverside, Upper West Side, New York tennis courts when we lived there during the 60s. Our Japanese friend Minori Lawson and her husband were friendly with Arthur, and they praised him a lot. He was a great human being. So love that comment as well. And let's look at a picture of you and another tennis great.
Jimmy Connors. And if you want to try to understand the level of what we're talking about here in today's world, Jimmy Connors was his own self. And when you talk about someone who was out on the court and left it out there, keep in mind, Jimmy was someone who was raised by his mother, who was a very strong-minded individual. And Jimmy was his own aggressive self, and he played that way, and he gave it all. And I think he left it on the court. Now, there were people who will say, well, they will quibble over John McEnroe's behavior on the court. Okay. But the fact is, if you're wondering today, you look around and you're trying to hope to find some young American players who will be able to achieve what Rafa Nadal, what Roger Federer, what Djokovic has achieved with all the 20 Grand Slam titles. Think of the Americans like Pete Sampras, Jimmy Connors, and others who came before. And the reason that you're seeing so few American top players is not because that they don't love tennis, but I think what you're finding is, if you go to Europe and look at the list of all-time top 100 players right now, many of those players are coming out of Eastern European countries like Croatia, like Slovakia, like Russia. They couldn't play in the years when the Russians were under communist rule, but now these great athletes, and they're athletes, they're 6'5", they're bigger, they're taller, and they want to succeed, and they know there's money in tennis, so they put their emphasis perhaps in tennis instead of going into soccer, instead of going into team sports. And they have good coaching now that they can get on a major level, and they're willing to pay that price and grow as human beings. And Jimmy Connors, I would say to you, he left it out there. And when he was on the court, that you were going to get a full-fledged performance, which is why when Arthur beat him in 75 at Wimbledon, Jimmy learned something from that. And that was that Arthur knew how to play and attack Jimmy. And that's what he did, adjusting to Jimmy Connors' style of play. But as someone who covered Jimmy, as someone who covered John McEnroe, and those players of that era, Bjorn Borg, another player who knew how to win and knew how to grow as a human being, they left it there, and there was no second guessing.
Thank you. Very, very helpful stories. And we could just talk tennis all day, but we've got lots more to cover. Let's talk another Olympic moment and this cover story, cover front page of the sports section that was sent to us by Wayne Camadoy.
What's more to say about that? I mean, when you have, world records that are set that just kind of blow you out of the water, and I will say that to Wayne, and that's what part of the visualization of being able to, take sports and give it the kind of treatment like this was with the typeface, with the big picture. I mean, this was not what the New York Times had been known for in its history. It was well written, but in terms of visual presence, the color photographs, the large type, and the playing with different issues took it to a new level. And I think in those days, it made the reporters more conscious when they were out there that they were going to be treated, whether it was on page one of the paper or whether it was going to be inside with those kind of headlines, that people were going to be reading those stories and they had to match their copy to what the event was. 1932, come on, that's a magic number. And I think when you get those kind of special performances, when Bob Beamon did 29.2.5 in the long jump in Mexico City, that was like 2 feet further than anybody had ever jumped in the long jump. And people were astonished that Beamon could do that. Now, it was at altitude, but he still achieved. And I think we tend to take some of those performances for granted. But in my office, I have a picture of Roger Bannister crossing the finish line of his first sub 4 minute mile at 3:59.4. And Bannister signed the picture. It was given to me as a gift, and I treasure it to this day because that performance, while not an Olympic performance, was something that set the standard by which milers and middle distance runners would be able to live up to. And I think today what's happening is that there's so much effort placed on winning at the expense of who that person became. Bannister became a doctor, was very successful. You look at other successful athletes who have made that transition, and you say they knew what they wanted to be. They were prepared to sacrifice for it, but they also learned as they were climbing the mountain how important it was to what that journey to the top was all about. And I think if you manage to succeed and you can look back without second guessing, then I think you've achieved what your goal was.
Shri, you're muted. You need to unmute, Shri. Nope, not yet.
Sorry about that. We wanted to show the book jackets of the books that you had done. So let's take a look at that. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief on these books. And the first book on the left, The Fifth Down, I wrote in 1971. It was a story of football as it's been in America. And what I most treasure about this is that the story deals with a high school football coach in Willits, California in 1969. Think about this now. He let his players vote on the starting lineup. And what set off was a revolution in the town because they lost their first 4 games because they picked their friends. And George Davis, who was the coach, who was a Renaissance man at the time, when the players finally got around to picking the best players, the team went on to win a share of the conference title. I wrote that in 71. 40 years later, a USC film professor, Richard Shepard, optioned the book, and we have a script for a movie on it, on the fifth down of that story. George Davis, one of those classic people that you have to respect, and truly an amazing guy. My Race Be Won was a collaborative book that I did with Vincent Matthews, who competed in 68 in Mexico City on the relay and won a gold. And then in 72, came back and won the gold medal in the 400 meters at the time. That title, My Race Be Won, was from some poetry that Vince Matthews used to write when he was away from the track. Now I lay me down the blocks. I ask the Lord for jocks and socks. If I should die before the gun, I ask the Lord, my race be won. How powerful is that? We've talked about Arthur Ashe off the court. It's a very special book to me too, because what Arthur says in there has so many things that are important. The Vince Matthews book, by the way, also dealt in his book with the '68 Mexico City Olympics and all the problems dealing with race relations and the quest for respect that Black athletes were seeking. And the final book, Chrissy, my own sport, Chrissy Evert, needless to say, after writing and following her career for so long, spending time with her and realizing how special she was, it was very important. And I think that was a phase of my life when I was fooling around with books and writing. And more recently, I've been doing documentary films on the Sweat Solution, a story about the Gatorade experiment and what happened to that 50 years later. And also, I worked with a documentarian, David Bailenson, on a documentary that was on the SEC channel earlier this year called Win or Else. It was the story of the 1978 Kentucky men's basketball team that won the NCAA title, and the players came back. We interviewed 14 of the players in Kentucky, and they told their story in a 1-hour documentary that I believe ESPN is going to rerun this fall. And it was a real treasure to be able to sit down with these players and listen to the mission that they had as athletes and as human beings.
Thank you, Neil. And folks, we're talking to Neil Amdur about his incredible career as a sports reporter and writer. And we're now going to turn our attention to the newspaper. Neil, you should know this is one of the latest times in our show that we've gotten to the paper because our conversation has been so good with you and hearing all these stories. As Patricia says, Neil is a walking Wikipedia. And that's something that's changed over your career, right? You would have been called a walking encyclopedia.
A walking Wikipedia. That's got an alliteration to it.
There you go. That's very nice. All right, let's take a look. Let's take a look at the paper. And please speak up as I read some of these headlines and just anything you'd like to say. As Taliban stoke fear, multitudes flee Afghanistan. That's the lead story. This chart, who are unvaccinated in America, and it shows you states where there's very little vaccination. So the dark purple is 70%, and the light purple is obviously the least. I'm not sure why so many states have insufficient data. Vermont, but West Virginia, and Georgia are not even here. But you can see so many places where people are not vaccinated. GOP strives to turn a riot upside down, blaming Pelosi to gain cover and avoid facts. It's amazing what has happened with the January 6th insurrection. Iran talks stall and centrifuges spin as hardliner takes reins. And this story here, Americans in limbo. This is as freeze lapses, fears of eviction may follow. And that was the eviction notifications and the moratorium in America ended last night. Some places there's an extension. I'm not sure what else is happening. And then when finding a meal seems medal-worthy, and this is about some of the hassles that journalists are having and others, they're not allowed to leave the venues and things like that. Very different from other Olympics, right, Neil?
Yes, it is. And the Times has, I think, about 30 people down there. In Tokyo, photographers, writers, editors. It's quite and they're living in different quarters, as John Branch wrote this morning. And I think it's a challenge. It's very different than anything that's been done before. And I think that puts that much more pressure on the journalists that are there to try to make sure that they can get the job done under the circumstances.
And again, John Branch was a guest on our show just a couple of weeks ago. Here's another thing that's changed in your career at the New York Times. An article on page 3 on how to organize your fridge. The Times is doing much more service journalism than it ever did, right?
Oh, for sure. And I think that's because readers are not only requesting, but I think they look for these. And I think that's part of what the responsibility of journalism is today.
Here's an international story from South Africa, a fight to keep plants in the desert, not in a pot. An ad for MoMA as the museums come back. And more stories about US-Iran relations and the refugee crisis. And this is such a sad story, an incredible journalist, photographer, Pulitzer Prize winner that I had the honor of meeting when he won the Pulitzer. This is Danish Siddiqui. His body has been found but was mutilated in Taliban custody, say officials. A very, very sad story. Student unions fighting to survive as Hong Kong moves to smother dissent. And all that promise of how China would treat Hong Kong obviously have disappeared. In the Andes, prayers to Doctor of the Poor unite the faithful. Beijing police detain pop star at center of Me Too storm in China. A very French greeting may not survive COVID. So I don't speak French, but says that President Macron, who has urged France to refrain from cheek-to-cheek smooches, opting for a fist bump instead. And you know all about how the French love to do the cheek-to-cheek greeting. For many tenants, a scramble to pay back rent or face eviction. We talked about this story. Very sad. I'm sorry we don't have enough time to go into this today. And meanwhile, Trump has built a war chest of more than $100 million. The Times said an astonishing haul for any former president. And more stories about the unvaccinated and the vaccine hesitant and the never will get a shot kind of folks as well. And then we're up to the obituaries. Are there memorable obituaries you worked on?
I can't say that I've written a lot of obituaries. I mean, I have done some, and it's always been an area that I felt was very important, which is why I'm so glad to see that the Times has become conscious about trying to expand the staff that they have with, for example, Richard Sandomir, who I hired at the Times to write sports and business, is over on the obit desk and has been writing some beautiful obits since he came over there. Penelope Green, another former reporter at the Times, they're not only good reporters, but they can bring style and knowledge. And the obits that I did write that come to mind, it's not that many. I just remember more recently, Frank Litzky was one that I wrote about, a former editor at the Times who was a very unusual editor, and his ability to be able to collect information and store it, and his attention to detail. And I think the Times is doing this now with their obits by finding the qualities in people that make them, that separate them from the pack and merit that kind of consideration. And I think while it is sad to see the obits, sometimes on a double spread like that, and lengthy stories, the fact that they can bring people to light in some of these obituaries makes you feel like these people are living forever and left their legacy, whether it's from Holocaust survivors, whether it's artists, whether it's journalists or photographers, whoever it is, their unusual nature, which made them very special and deserving of that type of treatment.
We always tell folks that if you're interested in obituaries for content and just want to learn more or pay tribute to someone, check out Miss You Graham app. You will find that very interesting. Okay, so we won't have a time to get to the rest of the paper, but let's look at the sports section together. And what fun, folks. We're reading the Sunday sports section with a former sports editor of the New York Times, Neil Amdur. And this is the cover. Talk about the use of image here, how the stories run, a headline at a time when the story's more than several, maybe 15, 20 hours old at this time. What are some of the decisions that go into the layout and display of a story like this?
Well, that's the thing that's interesting now is that, well, particularly with Tokyo, where you have the time change that really, that puts the pressure on journalism to be able to stay current knowing that when the paper is being delivered, there's actually live events being held, and so you don't want to make it feel as if what you're printing or reporting on is lost or has been tucked away. So on that cover, for example, that you're holding, I mean, the fact that Jamaica swept the 100-meter women's, I mean, that shot is very powerful. Not just because it exudes, the achievement, but also I think putting the women on the front like that is important because the women are an integral part of the Olympic movement and deserve their place. And Jamaica has always made it a point of having great sprinting from all the way back and very proud of it. So I think the fact that they were able to achieve this and a repeat winner, and then at the bottom you have a much more interesting story too, a news story about China and what they're doing in their quest for gold. The Chinese, as of that morning paper, had won more gold medals than the U.S. And I think China would probably use that as their own in the final verdict. If they win more golds, but the U.S. wins more medals, you can be assured the Chinese will be pitching the propaganda that, look at, we've got the gold, they've won, okay, they have more medals, but look what we've got. And that's how the positioning of these type of things when you're dealing with nationalism. And I think, the whole question of the Soviets, the Russian team, not Russians as such, but a Russian Olympic team that was selected after they were banned initially, creates a further situation for the International Olympic Committee because the Russians weren't even supposed to be there, but they're there. And how do you explain this to people who are trying to understand why a country that had a sophisticated doping program and was once banned is now allowed to send their athletes, several hundred, to win gold medals? So that inconsistency speaks again to what I say is a real serious problem at the international level for what the IOC and other organizations are doing that are inconsistent with great sports.
Thank you, Neil. One question. When you were at the Times, obviously the large part of your career, it was all about black and white photography, and then there was color photography. Talk about these two pages and what they say, what they convey, and what it means to you.
Well, I think that the decision to go into color was a decision that I think took it to another level because at the time when I was sports editor, which was around I was there for 12 years as sports editor, 1990 to 2002. And what I thought was happening at the time was it was a particularly important period in newspapers because remember the Facebook and the websites were not necessarily flourishing at that time. So people were still getting a lot of their news out of newspapers first. And that's why we would have late editions when we would be subbing stories, baseball stories and other things to get that stuff in the paper, especially even with color. It was very dramatic. We were competing against the Daily News, the New York Post, Newsday, Newark Star Ledger. And I think there was a certain pride in what the sports department and the people that were there doing, feeling that if they could compete with them with both photography-wise, with great pictures, and also with great layout, it made a statement that we're in the game and we're not going to be, sitting back. And that's why I think when you had the great layout people and photographers like Barton Silverman who would be able to get those classic pictures, you had to run them big. You had to make it so that you were saying to the tabloids, hey guys, we're not going to sit back and let you kick our ass. We're going out there and we're going to do some things. And in fact, we did. And my feeling was when I hired people, I wanted to know, can you compete against these people and what are you going to do about it? So.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Neil. Such great insights into what happens in these decisions as people make these decisions.
Can I give you the last question, and this will leave you if we're winding down. And this is a change of pace for you. When I would hire someone, the last question I would ask an applicant who was coming in to see me was, if you were a fruit, what would you be? And I did that intentionally because I wanted to see whether people knew who they were, their identity. How much do you know about yourself to really do this? So it became a kind of running joke at the paper. Be careful when Neil's last question is going to be, because I'm an apricot and I know why I'm an apricot. And I knew when Buster Olney said he was an apple, he was absolutely dead on. But I use that, but I got teased about that quite a bit when people would ask me that question, or I would throw it out there. And I still feel that knowing your identity and playing that, and that's in my 10 commandments. That's the last commandment I have, is if you were fruit, what would you be? Now, I'm not sure about you three, but I'll leave that for you to figure out if you can come up with an answer for me. I can tell you why I'm an apricot.
And sorry, and what are you? What's
I'm an apricot.
Apricot, and why is that?
An apricot is a singular fruit. It doesn't grow in bunches like grapes or other things. The other thing about the apricot is that you can't get it all the time. I mean, it's not like an apple or an orange or a banana. And I'm not that kind of person that way. The other thing about the apricot is what you see is what you get. You don't have to peel it away like you do a banana or like you do an orange. And with me, what you see is what you get. The other thing about an apricot is people who love apricots are really taken by them. And I have great friends, and that's why I feel like they're loyal and they're special. The other thing about the apricot too is, it wouldn't win the all-time fruit tournament because the peach is too much of a heavy hitter when the peach shines. But the apricot has a core. When you peel it away and you get that core, and that's used for facial scrubble and Laetrile. And I think I'm a soulful kind of person. So I may not beat the peach in the all-time tournament that Rich Sandomir ran in his book when he put it in the all-time 32 draws. But I will tell you that the apricot it holds itself well. And I'll be curious about you now. What are you going to tell me you are?
Well, I should also say the peach played a role in sports history with the peach basket and all of that. So that'd be another fruit that I think sports people would love. But I would say I am a mango because
there you go.
Because of the India connection. And in India, we call it king of fruits. And so you'd want to be the best fruit. But the problem with the mango, at least in America, is that the quality is often not as good as
you're an individual.
Want. Yeah.
The mango has a shine to it, and you shine on the air. There's no doubt about it. You're that way, and people who love mangoes, you bet. I mean, it's a singular fruit. And you are definitely an individualist. Good call. You got it.
Thank you. Patricia says I'm an apple because I love New York and probably a New Yorker because I can make it there. You can make it if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. And folks who are watching, tell us what fruit you are, either live or later. It'll be great to read those comments. And as we wind up here, we want to just thank everyone who's been watching. Neil, I'm going to come back to you for a final thought and some advice, and also how to watch what happens with civil rights and social justice with sports. So I'd like you to kind of ruminate on that for us in just a couple of minutes. We're going to do some housekeeping and then come back to you. Folks, our conversation with Neil, what a treat. We got to see less of the paper today, but that's perfectly okay. We encourage all of you to, of course, check out the stories that we've been talking about. And please subscribe and support to newspapers, local newspapers, wherever you live in the world. And of course, subscribe to our work through our social channels, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. We're here almost every Sunday at 8:30 a.m. Eastern. Let's tell you about our next show that's coming up. Is on August 15th. We have Lee Klontz, who is the Director of Teaching and Learning at Emory University and one of my favorite students of all time. He is going to be joining us. He knows more about digital than almost anyone I know. So to have him talk about the newspaper and news and journalism is going to be wonderful. And he's going to be joining us from Atlanta. So please join us on August 15th at 8:30 a.m. Eastern on all of the channels that you're on now. We also want to thank our incredible team of producers who do such great work. We have Neil Parekh at Neil Parekh. He's our executive producer. Paula Kiger, who's been doing such great work posting comments and annotating our show. She's at Big Green Pen. Carla Baranauckas, who brought us Neil and a great friend of our show. She is here as well. Julia Weeks at Julia L. Weeks, and Steve Taylor at Steve DeReeve. Speaking of Carla, we always tell folks about her wonderful newsletter that everyone should read, whether you're a journalist or not. It's called The Local Connection, and she takes national, international stories and tells you how to look at them and make them into local stories. And just last night, one of my students was asking me about that great newsletter, and so I was able to remind her to go to bit.ly/local news tips, bit.ly/local news tips. I think we're about to get two Neils on the screen in just a moment, but before that, let me just tell you about two of my upcoming shows. This Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, we have a very important show, Fighting the Virus and the Lies, and you may story about what's happening in St. Louis. And Dr. Faisal Khan, the director of public health in St. Louis, was verbally and otherwise attacked for asking for masks in St. Louis. He said, "I've never been subjected to the racist, xenophobic, and threatening behavior that greeted me in that county council meeting." Many of you saw that video. It was all over the internet. Well, he'll be with us to talk about what's happening. And we'll be joined by Aisha Sultan, who is a syndicated columnist and also in St. Louis. And we'll talk to Dr. Khan. So please join us 9 p.m. Eastern on my COVID show. And we'll have another episode on Thursday to talk about a book that's just been launched that looks at the rise of Indian Americans, including one Indian American named Kamala Harris. So that's at 9 p.m. on Thursday. And there's Neil wearing his Yankee pinstripes and his Yankee hat. And Neil, I know you weren't feeling too well, but you pulled off another great show.
Well, thank you, Sri. Appreciate it. And certainly a thrill to have Neil Amdur on the show. Anyone who loves journalism, anyone who loves sports history. I mean, we talked about the Mexico City in '68, Munich in '72, Nadia Comaneci, Montreal 76. Just incredible history. Not to mention all the tennis greats that Neil worked with, but what great stories too. And we had a number of people share what their fruit would be. Sri, we had Ron Thomas say that he would be an apple as well, in deference to New York, following Patricia's lead. Naomi said that it was an entertaining and fascinating show as usual. And let's see, who else do we have? Rose said that question is really the start of a good poem, she's sure. Diana, our friend, saying she is a Kiwi, soft inside with thick skin, traveled in both the East and West. So just great comments. And we'd love to bring Neil back on to share some thoughts. And as you mentioned, I always love sharing the screen with another Neil who spells his name the right way. So with Neil, thank you, Neil. We also had Neil Genslinger on the show earlier. Are there other Neils at the New York Times that we should be reaching out to, that we should book as guests?
I'd have to think about that one.
But
Neil, you didn't tell us what kind of fruit you are.
I knew you'd ask me that, and I've been racking my brain trying to think of what kind of fruit I would be. The one that comes to mind is a grape, because they're found in bunches, and part of what I am an extrovert, much to my wife's chagrin. I really don't like. I like to be surrounded by others and engage with others, and so that's really what comes to mind.
Cool. That's. You never have to apologize for that. I mean, at least I never have. My wife's a Kiwi and we get along fine.
Yeah, exactly. And we had a few more. Let's say Laura Silverman says she wouldn't be I'm not a fruit, I'm a skilled, experienced person. It makes her a prickly pear, I guess, by her own admission. So Neil, Sri wanted you to offer some final thoughts, particularly around the work that you've done, the intersection of sports and civil rights. and looking at where we've come over the last year and a half, particularly with Black Lives Matter. Final thoughts from you.
I think that there's a lot of work that has been done, but there is much more to do. And I think it requires what I would describe as commitments from a lot of people who have wrapped themselves in sometimes in partisanship. And I think you don't move as quickly until you get the vision and the leadership. And you can see that in areas like women's tennis, where you had someone like Billie Jean shepherding the troops, or in other sports that have had progress. And I think in the civil rights movement, the frustration for me has always been that the promise is so strong. I mean, when I put the first Black athletes on an all-city team at the Miami Herald in 1965, I mean, when the this was news that was totally shocking for some people, because the teams were still, the schools were still segregated. And I think these days we have to look beyond, and we have to try to find ways to be able to bring people together. And part of it is that everyone wants their objective, but no one sometimes is willing, as Jim Lair has pointed out, to look, and grow as you climb the mountain together, to feel like when you got to the top, it's all there. So I would just leave it and say that I'm encouraged, but I wish I could feel stronger and better about where we are and what we need to do, because more work needs to get done.
That's incredible. Thank you, Neil. That was really great. Really appreciate that. Sri, anything to add? Any final thoughts?
No, I'm just so grateful to Neil for bringing me a great life highlight today, talking to you. But that 1993 day where you brought Arthur Ashe to speak to us, and then he would die a few months later, is something I will never forget, Neil. And the fact that I kept his obituary tells you how much that day meant to me. And it's been pretty good condition, you got to say, for the newspaper.
I would say so. Thank you, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure to spend time with you.
Thank you. And everyone, we'll see you in 2 weeks, August 15th. Neil's taking a well-deserved vacation, and we're all going to read the papers ourselves, and then we'll be back. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.